The opening poem in the quartets is Burnt Norton, and it begins with epigraphs from Heraclitus. Heraclitus was a 5th to 6th century writer. This is pre-Socrates. And Heraclitus, the opening lines that Eliot draws from, I'm using a translation by Kevin Hart, who is a Christian theologian. And the opening lines say something like, though wisdom is universal, many live as though they have their own wisdom. But the words that are being used here for wisdom in the first part of Heraclitus's sentence is logos. And in the second part, it's more of it's phronesis. It's a practical wisdom. So one way that Hart translates this is the Christian revelation is given to all, though many persist in following their own minds. Well, the reason that Hart can translate this in this way is logos in the Greek New Testament is actually what we use for the word in John 1, right? The word is with God, the word was God. So it's logos, it's the Christian revelation, it's the understanding of a divine wisdom. So this divine wisdom may be available to all and universal. And then the second part, phronesis, but many persist in their own practice of wisdom, right? Their own practical way of thinking about what is good and true and beautiful. And then the second part, Hart translates Heraclitus's lines, one transcends one's sinful state only through humility by becoming alter Christus. And this is a rendering, not a direct translation. The translation itself would have been the way upward and the way downward are one and the same, right? But that in itself is a paradox. How can the way up be the way down? And so Hart's rendering explains a little bit of the way that paradox plays out in Christianity. If you actually go up, transcend your sinful downward state through humility going downward, you then are exalted upward in the same way that Christ is. And so this move to go down in order to go up are one and the same in the Christian understanding. I've outlined here some of the main themes or ideas that come out in Burnt Norton, and I would like to read the opening of the poem, and then we can kind of walk through some of these pieces. I'd like to begin by walking through the opening section of the poem, Burnt Norton, and I will begin just by reading the words. As I said before, these words may not make sense. We do have the epigraph of Heraclitus, who has given us these paradox to look for and ways of thinking about ideas that seem contradictory but can be true, ideas that are initially confusing, but we have to have the patience to let the poem break us out of our assumptions that we might be able to see things more deeply and more clearly. I'm going to read the poem, listen to the words rather than try to break them down at first and make sense of them. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. Footfalls echo in the memory down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened, into the rose garden. My words echo thus in your mind. It's a beautiful opening, and the ruminations on time should make us think of St. Augustine, who in his Confessions actually meditates on time and eternity in Book 11. And this is the story of Augustine's spiritual autobiography. As we've said before, the quartets are going to be layered with these allusions to tradition and its influence on us. And by unpacking some of these influences, we better get a sense of what the poem is doing. So in the same way that Augustine meditated on time and eternity in order to understand his Confessions, his conversion story, he was then thinking not just about his own moment in time, his chronos. He's trying to understand how his story plays out in the kairos, right? Where in eternity, in the eternal story, what is Augustine's conversion doing? And then the story of Augustine's conversion is a story of a spiritual journey. So the quartets, by imitating and alluding to Augustine, are also trying to themselves become a spiritual journey, not only for Eliot, but then also for the reader of the quartets themselves. So time present and time past are both perhaps present and time future. And here Eliot begins to play on our understanding of what present means. Present in the sense of now, but also present in the sense of being, to be present there. And we see in these opening lines, as actually a student was pointing out to me, we have an outline in some ways for the quartets themselves. We're going to look in Burnt Norton at time present and time past, present and time future contained in the past. Burnt Norton was a place that Eliot went to, and then when he's writing about this poem, he's writing about visiting there in the past. And of course, the place itself is reminiscent of a place of the past. So it takes on these layers. This last section, which is very like Neil Gaiman sounding almost, down the passage which we did not take towards the door we never opened into the rose garden. And we have our first mention of the rose. That word is going to act as one of the notes in the music of the quartets. And also the word garden will act in the same way as a note that plays over and over again. And both of those words are going to take on different meanings in different contexts in the poem. And just a moment later, we see rose again and we see garden again. When we get to these, and then of course echo too, we have an echo of an echo in this section. When we get to the next entrance into the garden becomes the garden of Burnt Norton, which was a mansion or an estate, but also the Garden of Eden. So it takes on this second meaning, right? This eternal meaning of what the garden always means. We should also be thinking still of Augustine in the garden. That's where he was converted, and Augustine sets his conversion in the garden. It might have been literally where he was converted, but also it becomes significant of his spiritual conversion, right? The return to the garden. Other echoes inhabit the garden, shall we follow? Quick, said the bird, find them round the corner. Through the first gate into our first world, right? And this is the first quartet entering us into the first world. These thoughts of what is coming first, understanding our story in light of the story of Genesis. Again, a move that Augustine makes in the latter half of Confessions when Augustine meditates on the meaning of creation and on the meaning of Genesis. These invisible presences that Eliot responds to here, right? These stories that are part of our story. They were there, dignified, invisible, moving without pressure over the dead leaves in the autumn heat through the vibrant air. These dead leaves will become part of the pattern as well. It's a reference in some ways to a line in Virgil in which the shades are compared to dead leaves in the wind. And then the dry and the brown from the dry salvages, we'll come back to that in the third quartet. And this movement now, this impetus to go, to begin the journey, to start out, to depart, the movement of always departing and arriving and traveling that takes place in this poem. In the third movement of Burnt Norton, we have a hint of a contrast between the garden in which Eliot first draws us in to a new place. Here is a place of disaffection, time before and time after in a dim light, neither daylight investing form with lucid stillness, turning shadow into transient beauty, with slow rotation suggesting permanence, nor darkness to purify the soul, emptying the sensual with deprivation, cleansing affection from the temporal, neither plenitude nor vacancy, only a flicker over the the strained time-ridden faces, distracted from distraction by distraction, filled with fancies and empty of meaning, tumid apathy with no concentration, men and bits of paper whirled by the cold wind that blows before and after time, wind in and out of unwholesome lungs, time before and time after. Erectation of unhealthy souls into the faded air, the torpid driven on the wind that sweeps the gloomy hills of London, Hampstead, and Clerkenwell, Camden and Putney, Highgate, Primrose, Ludgate. Not here the darkness in this twittering world. Descend lower, descend only into the world of perpetual solitude. World, not world, but that which is not world, internal darkness, deprivation and destitution of all property. He begins to get darker and lower. And what is happening here is he's contrasting the garden in which they entered with the deceptive bird that draws you into the garden, and it's the rose garden, and it's the resonance of the first world. And now this is being contrasted with the London Underground, which will become one of the tropes in the poem as well. This is the down below, the descent that almost takes on the meaning of the darkness of the world, the desiccation of the world sense, the evacuation of the world fancy, the inoperancy of the world spirit. It's a very dark way of reading the London Underground, this place of commerce and movement and rushingness down below.